From Rhode Island.
I thank the senator from Hawaii, who has been such an ardent and effective ally in this fight, for coming to the floor today and for all of our work in the Judiciary Committee and also through briefs that we file in the Supreme Court, trying to wake up the court to what's happening around them. I would add an additional point to my description of this little node of the dark money apparatus that has controlled the makeup of the Supreme Court and works very hard to control the decisions of the Supreme Court, and too often does, because you've heard Senator Durbin and others speak on the floor today about the biggest dark money contribution ever made, $1.6 billion given to an organization run by this same individual. And you see it going in, but only because some whistleblower told the press what had happened. But even knowing that $1.6 billion went in, you don't know where it goes next, because this complicated apparatus and others like it enable the money to be sluiced through underground, subterranean, clandestine channels and pop out in political races through unknown, phony front groups with preposterously sweet names, and nobody who's a citizen is allowed to understand what's happening. You can bet the word gets to the candidate about who is behind New Jerseyans for peace and puppies and prosperity. And you can bet the big donors know, and if it's a House race, you can bet the House leaders know, and if it's a Senate race, you can bet the Senate leaders know, and you can bet that gives immense clout at stopping things in this building. And sure enough, that $1.6 billion went into Marble Freedom Trust. And one of the first things it did was give money to the Concord Fund, one of the other Leonard Leo groups. You'll recognize that as this chart behind me. And you add to it the Marble Freedom Trust, that was the vehicle into which the $1.6 billion got dumped, and then zoop, here came money straight to the Concord Fund, among other uses of it. So this thing, it's sort of a creature of multiple fronts. And I was struck today when I read a news article about the resignation in Iraq of the finance minister, who's largely regarded as being the voice of integrity and decency and honesty in that government, and he quit. And he said one of the reasons was that he felt that there was around him a vast octopus of corruption and deceit. This is just one piece of a vast octopus of corruption and deceit whose target is the American people, and whose desire is to control government from behind the scenes without even showing up and showing who they are. If you want to see some of this mischief in action, and in relation to what I've said about how this captured court with its FedSoc justices has delivered for the big donor interests, the biggest thing that they've done so far in terms of affecting the trajectory of honesty and decency and public accountability in this country has been in a case called Americans for Prosperity Foundation versus Bonta. What did the judges who dark money put onto the court that dark money built do? They built a brand new constitutional right to dark money. Unprecedented. And when they did it, when the case came up to them, interestingly, as part of this octopus of deceit, are innumerable front groups that file amicus briefs. I talked about how they don't disclose and the court lets them get away with it. Let me give you an idea of the number. At the certiorari stage, which for those not familiar with Supreme Court practice, is the point where the Supreme Court decides whether or not they will take up the case. And then there's the merits decision later on how they decide the case. But on the question of whether they take up the case, we counted about 50 of these phony, dark money funded front groups coming in and saying, you got to take up this case, you got to take up this case, you got to take up this case. It was signaling, it was flares, it was semaphore telling the FedSoc justices, we put you there, this is what we want you to do. So let's take a quick look at a little bit about the Americans for Prosperity Foundation, because it's related. Remember I said about 501c3s and 501c4s twinning together and having basic identity? Well, the Americans for Prosperity Foundation is the 501c3 twin to a 501c4 called Americans for Prosperity. And guess what Americans for Prosperity is? It is the biggest battleship in the Koch brothers' political influence operation. It is the mothership. It is as political as you get. It goes directly into elections and spends dark money. And here are the big differences between Americans for Prosperity and the Americans for Prosperity Foundation. Well, the CEO and director of Americans for Prosperity is, amazingly enough, the CEO and director of the Americans for Prosperity Foundation. And the secretary of the Americans for Prosperity group happens also to be the corporate secretary of the Americans for Prosperity Foundation. How about that? Oh, here's a big difference. The senior vice president of grassroots operations for Americans for Prosperity is the senior vice president of state operations for Americans for Prosperity Foundation. There's a difference. The treasurer and vice president of Americans for Prosperity is the same as the treasurer and vice president of finance for the Americans for Prosperity Foundation. And the director of Americans for Prosperity is the chair of the Americans for Prosperity Foundation. There's a thing in law called piercing the corporate veil. This is a corporate veil you could pierce with a banana. This is the kind of phony fun and games that dark money allows to intrude into our democracy. And in this terrible death loop, dark money puts justices on the Supreme Court who get told by dark money amici what they want in flotillas of 50, and then deliver for dark money to a nominal plaintiff who is the indistinguishable twin of the Koch brothers' political battleship. Letting that money loose into our politics with now constitutional imprimatur. And they show up in droves. Here's just one case. Seal of Law. This was the one about the Consumer Financial Protection Board. You know, the dark money people hate the Consumer Financial Protection Board. In fact, they hate regulation. That's why they're trying to undo American government as best they can. So here are some of the amici that showed up in Seal of Law. I actually put this in my brief to the Supreme Court in that case as an appendix so they could see what was going on around them. A lot of good it did. So here are some of the front groups, all of whom take dark money, and here are some of the dark money sources we were able to trace them having taken. Donors Trust, widely described as the ATM of the far right. It has no purpose. Donors Trust doesn't make a product. You can't buy a Donors Trust car or bicycle or tire or pedal. It doesn't provide services. You can't go to Donors Trust and get your taxes done. You can't go to Donors Trust and get your shoes polished. It does one thing and one thing only. It takes money in, it scrubs off the identity of the person who gave it the money, and then it sends the money where that person wants as Donors Trust. That's it. It's an identity laundering machine for the dark money operation that we have running for this vast octopus of deceit. And here are other foundations: Bradley, Scaife, Searle, Koch. And look at how much of this is in common. That was not described to the court. So, my time is running out. I'll say two things as I go. One is, until the Supreme Court opened the floodgates of unlimited money, Republicans wanted disclosure. Republicans wanted disclosure. Mitch McConnell, the leader, we need to have real disclosure. Why would a little disclosure be better than a lot of disclosure? He was in favor of a lot of disclosure on Meet the Press. I think disclosure is the best disinfectant, he wrote. We could do disclosure more frequently. I think disclosure is the best disinfectant. Mitch McConnell. But then along came the Supreme Court in 2010. They opened the floodgates of unlimited money, and particularly the fossil fuel industry, which wanted to stop climate legislation, knew that if it showed up as Exxon, as Marathon, as Chevron, as Shell, the public would get the joke. Their unlimited money would be useless because everybody would see the self-interest and the corruption behind all of that. So they immediately went to work through phony front groups, 501c4s, donors' trusts, shell corporations. And the Supreme Court let them do it. Despite the fact that 8-1, the Supreme Court and Citizens United has said, without transparency, this unlimited money is corrupting. Without transparency, this unlimited money is corrupting. Despite having said that, for 12 years, they've done nothing but let the dark money flow. Over $1 billion now into any single election. Great. It is intensely frustrating to see our country head down this filthy road where huge special interests, defined by just a few characteristics. One, they've got unlimited money to spend. Two, they can win in politics by spending it. And three, they want to hide. Is that group of people the ones we want controlling our country? I don't think so. How about regular voters? How about regular people? How about farmers and doctors and business owners, nurses? No. I know the leader wants to come to the floor, and I will yield as soon as he comes to the floor. Before he does, I want to thank him for bringing this measure here, for the strength of his statements, for the strength of his commitment, for his help to organize all of this. This began originally as his bill years ago after Citizens United. So I want to yield to him and when he gets here. But I want to go back to this departure of Minister Alawi, who talks about the Iraqi state having become degraded and become a plaything of special interests. That's the choice we face in this vote. Is this going to be America the beautiful, or is this going to be America the degraded plaything of special interests? This vote will determine it, and I yield to the leader for his remarks.